Hello everyone. So you heard my name is in fact Lily Dart, and I am in fact the head of design systems for Lloyds Banking Group. So if you haven't, so probably most of you bank in some way, shape or form with Lloyds Banking Group and often don't know it. So we are Lloyds Bank, obviously, but also Halifax, MBNA credit cards, we do Scottish Widows Insurance, we run Bank of Scotland. It's all one big bank hiding in secret. Before I get started, I'm going to talk about kind of the very intense complexity of trying to deliver a design system in an organisation the size of Lloyds Banking Group. But I just want to understand how many people here actually have a design system in their organisation at the moment. Cool. Okay, less than half. Okay, good. I'm going to explain what a design system is, don't worry. How many of you have heard of design systems? I'm assuming most of you because you're at an event. Okay, cool. So some of you know though, so that, okay, good. How many of those people who have heard of them but don't have one actually are confident that they understand what one is? Less people than have a design system, so that's interesting. Cool, okay, don't worry about it. We're going to work this out. So design systems, they are the hot new thing right now. So both in the design community and in the front-end developer community. And this is an interesting one for me because I'm a designer now, but early parts of my career I was design and front-end. So I tend to kind of sit in the middle of those two communities. And this is the first time I think that the design and front-end have actually cared about the same thing at the same time, which is quite exciting. But as with many hot new things, and as you can probably tell from how many people put their hands up, they are pretty widely misunderstood. So let's spend a little while just defining what it is we're talking about. If you weren't sure what a design system is, then you're definitely not alone. So if you do a quick search for what is a design system in Google, you will see Google reveals these commonly asked and answered questions. So it actually confuses design systems with systems design, which is a completely different thing. We also have why do systems fail? What types of system, what are the types of system design? I mean, I don't even know the answer to that question because it's just a different thing. But let's start with the obvious question. What is a design system? So Brad Frost, who is widely considered as like the prince of all design systems, or the king, it depends on how you feel about him. He says, I tend to define a design system as the official story of how your organization designs and builds digital products. Now, I find this to be an exceptionally not useful description of a design system because what the hell is it? But it does give you a sense of two things. The first one is that design systems are unique to the organizations that they are produced in, and that's a really important one. And that's because they can include a lot of different things, a lot of different ingredients go into building our digital products and services. And often the things that are important in each organization is going to differ, and so each of them look different. My hopefully more useful description, and I must admit to have a copywriter help me with this, so hopefully it still makes sense because I paid someone to help me, is a design system is a product made for the organization that you're working in. It provides the tools, materials, guidance, and standards needed for digital design and delivery. So we'll pick into what that means in practice a little bit more. So from the basics, all good design systems start from three things. They start from the organization's vision, they start from its design and technical principles, and they start from its branded look and feel. These three things feed into typically a design systems team, or it might be a collection of ad hoc people who want to create a design system. Now, this team create reusable code and tools and guidance, and even sometimes governance, so things like project sign-off might be one way of doing it, or design crits might be another way of doing governance. And your design systems team might be responsible for that, and they do that to help teams deliver to the vision, the principles, and the brand language in practice, right? So their mission is to make it really easy to deliver on these three things that the organization has said is important. Teams then take the content from that design system or the tools from the design system to use in their projects. So sometimes they also do things like create a new reusable component and they'll feed that back into the design system team, which you can see in this little backwards arrow here. Or it might be some other kind of guidance. It might be that they have tested something in context and now they know to feed something back into the team because it didn't work or it did work as intended. Sometimes they also, and often in fact, need to create custom components or patterns or some other piece of guidance or design for the specific problems that this team is trying to solve. So typically this team is trying to solve a different problem to this team, because otherwise you'd all be in the same place at the same time, right? Now, these typically won't be fed back into the design system, and they won't be fed back because they're not reusable for other teams, because that's the specific problem that those guys are trying to solve. So finally, the teams will deploy the work they've done for the end-to-end product or service. And this is going to be a combination of stuff from the design system and unique stuff that they have created in the team level. Now, one thing to note here is that the design system team doesn't have direct access to the customer, right? So the end product blob on the end, that's where we're touching the customers. So most of us actually in the design system team are never going to have direct access. That happens through the teams. So this is why we call them design systems internal products, because actually they serve the needs of the teams around us to help them deliver better, rather than directly serving the needs of the customers. They do ultimately do that, but actually your users as a design system owner are the designers and developers who work around you. So we'll talk more detail later, but this is the design system for Lloyds. So we've called it Constellation. There are a lot of space puns. We really like Star Trek, particularly in the newsletter. It's quite a problem. I think sometimes people don't entirely understand what we're saying unless they're sci-fi fans, but we do, and we're very happy with that. So Constellation includes a bunch of stuff. It includes our brand standards, it includes copywriting guidance and quality criteria, it includes page templates, the standard components that you would expect, and some other things too. Our work gets most detailed in the reusable components that we provide. So these are the core elements that we know are going to be consistent across any web page in Lloyds Banking Group. And they come in 4 different brand flavors. So you can see Lloyds, Halifax, Boss and MBNA up here. This is our brand provider switcher that will allow us to switch between what is essentially the same set of components but in different colors. So outside of the written guidance, we also have 2 other kind of parts of product that are our main central focuses. So the first one is this sketch library, and this allows our UI designers to create pages with the standardized components that are described in the website of guidance, and an exactly matching library of React components, so that when the designers pass the designs over to the developers don't need to do much additional work to make those components match what's in the design system, or they don't have to do any to make it match what's in the design system, but they will still have to create some custom components depending on exactly what type of problem your customers are facing. So that's what we have. Why do we have it? Now, the practice of design systems came about for many reasons, and they have a very clear heritage in the pattern library movement. In fact, we were talking about this earlier, and how a pattern library is not a design system, but that's a conversation over drinks later. So you can also see it in the tone and voice guidance movement. So if you've ever seen MailChimp's tone and voice documentation, that's the beginnings of a design system. And there have been a bunch of other things that seek to rationalize how we deliver and design websites. In my opinion, however, they have become popular because of the way we have scaled our businesses over time. So I've worked with and in many larger organizations, and I tend to specialize in digital transformation. So I go somewhere where there is a bit of a team or no team at all and create one. So in those teams where we've built digital teams from scratch, in my experience, there's a common pattern of how we scale teams. Even when we know the trip hazards to do it the wrong way, we still tend to hit the same kind of barriers. And we scale teams, obviously, because we want to deliver more or deliver faster, right? Those are our motivations for hiring more people. But the thing that we often don't recognize until it's too late is that scale also changes our ways of working, and usually becomes a struggle between autonomy, which can obviously let us move faster, and overall quality, which can reduce when the teams are left to themselves, because if you've got 3 different teams doing 3 different things at speed, then it's not often that they're going to align. So a small team doesn't operate like a team of any other size, right? Small teams often have low autonomy, but they can actually still work at pace. And a small team is the only time that you will see this in the kind of arc of development here. The reason that they can do that is that they don't have a large digital estate. So that means that senior folks in their organisation are able to review everything that they produce. And the review process, although sometimes that can be painful with senior folks, in general actually is going to improve the quality. It's going to improve the alignment of what you put out there because someone is checking over everything you do. But because those teams are small and they have fewer overheads, they're still actually able to deliver at speed. Now, as teams become bigger, maintaining that level of control becomes much more difficult for their managers. And there's more to review. There's a bigger digital estate, right? They don't have enough time to have visibility of everything that's going out. So their need to have that visibility is now slowing down teams' delivery. Senior folks are finding them more ways to have more autonomy because they know that that will speed them up. In most cases, however, this goes way too far. And in a wish to recreate the speed that teams had when they were small, they're giving way too much freedom and too much autonomy. And it results in this lack of alignment where everyone ends up doing different things and a reduced overall quality of what they're putting out. So at this point, organisations tend to start screaming for more governance and more control to reduce the autonomy that the teams had. They want to have more sign-off and tick box exercises. But when successful organisations mature, actually, they realise that autonomy hasn't been the problem. It's the thing that can, as we've said, give them speed. The problem is actually alignment. And you need both autonomy and alignment to operate at speed and at scale. So a design system is one way to do this, and it specifically creates alignment around the digital user experience, which, as we know, is actually a really big, complicated area. It does this while keeping autonomy high, and this is the solution. When we say design systems are hot right now, what we mean is this is the solution the industry is gravitating towards after 20 years of operating and realizing that this is a problem. It's there to fix some of the experience issues that we've started to see at scale. And some of those issues, from my experience in particular at a bank, and working at scale, are things like accessibility. So if we take the colour palette, for example, each new interpretation of the colour palette risks accessibility failures. Now, accessibility, as we know, is much more than colour, right? But let's take that narrow view for the moment. Hopefully you're all familiar with W3C. They're responsible for our web standards, including accessibility and inclusion. Their web contrast accessibility guidelines, which you may have heard referred to as WCAG, tell us whether or not we are using accessible colour combinations. So this is part of the new palette for the Halifax rebrand. So if you bank with Halifax, you've got a lovely new rebrand coming. Be excited, it's going to be great. It's not going to be that great. We actually have about 15 colours overall, including white, functional greys and error colours. So this is just a sample of kind of 6 or 7 colours that I've pulled out. As someone who sets the standards for Lloyds Banking Group, including those for accessibility, so that's part of my job, it's my job to make sure that these aren't used in wrong or inaccessible combinations, right? So that seems fairly straightforward. Or maybe it's not, when you consider that more than half of these colour combinations are going to fail when combined together. Now, this isn't a badly designed palette. I mean, my team doesn't design it, the brand team designs it, and we take it for interfaces with some adjustments to make sure that it's accessible. But it's not an uncommon situation. Any designer in here will be able to tell you this is pretty common, right? Colours don't often combine together in an accessible way. So if you consider that the average amount of colours in a digital palette will be around 15, with the core colours and then the things like the functional greys and whites, let's consider that each of those 15 colours could be combined with any of the other 15 colours in your interface at some point, either accidentally or intentionally. So that's 225 potential colour combinations just from one palette, right? And that's one aspect of accessibility. So even for a well-designed palette, the majority of those combinations are going to end up being inaccessible, as you saw from that page. Probably, 80% of them are going to end up being inaccessible. So that's quite a high risk factor for someone like a bank, where you can be sued quite easily for not providing, quite rightly, for not providing accessible services to the people that you serve. If someone can't access their money, that's a pretty serious issue, right? Now, the problem is that it's not at all common to find these rules written down, right, to stop these wrong combinations from happening. And it seems like an obvious thing, particularly anyone who's used to using accessibility color checkers. But I asked designers on Twitter how often they had access to design documentation like this, and 59% said they had rarely had it. So that's in their career, 59% of UI designers have rarely had access to documentation, any kind of design documentation. 14% said in their career they had never had access to design documentation. And this is the basics, right? So these are the things that as organizations, as digital organizations, we should be considering. Now, perhaps more importantly, if designers don't have access to these things, then developers definitely don't, right? So it's clear our organizations urgently need to address this type of risk, and design systems is one of the ways that they've been doing that. The risk is definitely bigger than accessibility, particularly for a bank as well, because for us, again, access to money is important, but safety and security is important too. And we know that customers may perceive an inconsistent UI as unprofessional, buggy, but actually at worst, they might perceive it as fraudulent. You know, do they actually know that it is a web page from their bank, or do they think it's someone trying to steal their money? And while we'd like to believe that customers are carefully checking the URL of each page that they visit to check for fraudulent pages, in reality, their checks are based more on look and feel and tone of voice and their gut. And even for us professionals in the room, I think we can probably say that's true of us too. So the more unpredictable we make our digital experiences, the harder we make it for customers to notice the difference between our websites and fraudsters' websites. So let's talk a little bit about what inconsistency means at this kind of scale. This is a 10-minute audit of the buttons on halifax.co.uk, covering areas of our sites that don't yet use our design system. So you can see that type, styling, size, and color is all different, and this is just the buttons. So if, as a Lloyds designer, I'm unable to tell you what our primary and secondary button styles are, then our customers definitely will be struggling to identify the most important action on any given page. Even if we remove the examples that break rules because of color or typography, we're still left with a very inconsistent set, right? And that's for a good reason. Because if we go back to our color example, we know that we have 225 potential color combinations for a palette. Now, Lloyds actually has 350 designers, right? So that's quite a lot of designers, each making their own judgment call without the design system, without the documentation on how to combine those colors together. So let's times that 225 color combinations by the amount of designers we have. So that's potentially over 78,000 individual decisions over the lifetime of a user interface. And that's just on how, where, and when to implement the color, right? So that doesn't actually account for all of the things like what is the size of the button and should it have a chevron or not. And the worst thing is that number's going to go up for every new designer you add, right? So every time a new designer gets added to the project, they're going to do their own set of decisions all over again. Now, in reality, you would hope that the majority of those decisions would be the same, but the anecdata that I see every day is that actually in reality, they're all slightly different. And each of those tiny differences builds up to create this poor, unpredictable experience for our customers, and it leaves them puzzling out how to use our interfaces, which I think we can say with some certainty is not the target user experience we were going for. And perhaps you can see with that in mind how it's possible to have all of these tiny variations of font and size and spacing and whether or not it has a chevron and even a little bit color on these as well. But you also have to wonder how many of these variations were actual conscious design decisions and how many were errors in replication between designers and developers. So who wants to guess, if we've got 350 designers, who wants to guess how many developers we have? 20. Oh God, if only that were true. No, try again. Higher? 9,000, well done. That's the first time someone has anywhere near correctly guessed. So we have 9,000 developers, both offshore and on. And 350 designers, particularly when you consider most of them actually aren't UI designers, kind of pales in comparison to that in terms of making the right decisions, right? And so that's a problem because actually design documentation, even if you account for the fact that we have nowhere near enough designers does not deliver products to customers, right? Our design documentation, our sketch files doesn't do anything to get something to a customer. Code does. So much of our work to remove inconsistency has to operate at the level of code, because that's where the symptoms of the problem are actually being seen by customers. However, interesting thing for me is, I'm quite visible. People come to me for advice about design systems sometimes. In the last 3 months, I've had meetings with 4 different teams who want to start their own design system. Now, of those teams, only 1 of the 4 had actually spoken to the developers in their organization before coming to me first for external advice. So why is this still happening, right? Because the developers are part of your design system. You don't get to deliver anything to customers without your developers. But when you Google for designers and developers, we still see these hundreds of articles on designer-developer handoff and whether designers should code to bridge the gap. And oh my God, should designers code? Just 10 years of conversation that's been. Now, in reality, most design systems don't care about whether or not a designer can code, but they do care about how closely aligned we are in order to make a good product. And they really care about the movement of information from designer to developer, because what designers produce doesn't have direct contact with customers, right? As much as a designer, I would like to say I am of key importance to the process. In reality, you can take me out and something will still get to the customer. The question is, what is the quality of that thing? Every customer gets that customer-facing interface because a developer has built it, right? So when we, developers and designers, use different naming conventions to describe the same thing, like is it a pop-up or an interstitial or a dialogue, or when designers are using one hex code and developers are using another, and these are real hex codes that I took off those buttons earlier, we are making it harder to ensure that what designers produce and test with user researchers is actually what the customer is going to see in context, right? We are introducing waste and inconsistency into our design and development process. So a design system is asking how much of this connection between the 2 specialists can we align, or ideally, how much can we automate through out-of-the-box tooling like component libraries, among other things. And this is incredibly important somewhere like Lloyds, because not only do we have these 350 designers, not only do we have 9,000 developers, we also have a host of other product owners and business analysts making design decisions as well, because we are doing things at such amazing scale. Often we are not staffed with proper multidisciplinary teams to be able to make decisions. So hopefully you have a fairly good sense by now of what goes into any old design system. More specifically for us, and I've shown you a bit of this already, we have colors, which is important, as we have found out today, because of the horrible combinations you can put them in. We have fonts, we have components, we have guidance, and we have code. But our design system also includes anything else we need as a team to implement a good customer experience. So an example for us that isn't shown here is that we have a tool that tests the reading age of your content. So for us, we have loads and loads and loads of customers. Most of the UK touches in some way, shape or form, varying ages of reading level, skill and comprehension. And we need to make sure, as a risk and experience factor, that everyone can understand the technical and financial information that we give them. So that is also part of our design system and design standards. So yeah, this is our design system, right? Let's talk about the content of what we put in it and why, and let's also talk briefly about some of the hard choices that have gone into creating it. So originally the team didn't have this beautifully designed website. We actually had these UI kits, which were not really a design system. They were just sketch files that we were using to copy and paste components from one design file to another. Now, again, not a design system, but they were important because they worked well to introduce designers to sharing and reuse, which, as you saw from the stats earlier, they haven't really come across, most of them in their career. They don't really know how to share and reuse. After I joined, however, we realized that some of the designers, in fact, most of the designers, were using those kits and they were out of date. So we switched over to sketch libraries, and those allowed us to automatically update the components that the designers used with the click of a button. This was a pretty small rebellion against the way that things had been working. There was an existing design process before the design system came along. That was nobody really shares, everybody does their own thing, and if they do share, they're copy pasting from one sketch file to another, right? But this switch to libraries was massively uncomfortable for the designers who hadn't used libraries before. Because suddenly there was this team of people who could update all of the tooling that they rely on to do their jobs, potentially without any notice. So designers were unhappy and afraid, and we had to build a lot of trust with them to make that work. We also took a bigger step later on, kind of facing into the existing process of the organisation by choosing not to support Axior for interactive prototyping. We had a set of components in Axior, one in Sketch and one in Code, and that meant that we were encouraging people when they were during their design and build process to rebuild 3 times. So a UX designer would build it in Axior, a UI designer would rebuild that in Sketch, and then a developer would rebuild it in Code, and often those 3 journeys would not look at all like one another. So most of it was throwaway work. Now, as an organisation, we are very pro-prototyping, but this particular approach was encouraging a massive amount of waste in the design process. And it meant that us as a design system team, which facing into nearly 10,000 individual contributors, we're a 10-person team, but that's not very big in the grand scheme of things. We're maintaining the components in 3 different locations. So that was keeping the designers in my team busy, it was keeping the designers in other parts of the organisation busy, but we couldn't see that it was adding any value to our customers. So we wanted to focus on building this kind of detailed usability guidance instead of providing the components in yet some other kind of format. We also hoped that diverting our attention away from Axior, we could spend the time helping teams to actually prototype in code. This was us making a conscious choice to change the way that the organisation was designing and delivering, because we felt that an approach that brought designers closer to the medium that they worked in might actually start to add more value in terms of what we output in the end. Both of these decisions were pretty unpopular in the beginning. As a small team, however, we can't support every variation of workflow in the bank, and there is pretty much every variation that you can possibly imagine of workflow. Even just trying to define what a UX designer does is incredibly difficult because every single one has a different view on what their role is. So we often have to make decisions based on what we think will encourage the best customer experience. And in reality, that often means being the bad guys or the design system police, as I'm sure you've probably heard before. So that's a bit about our context. It's a bit about some of the things that have been difficult in a very whirlwind tour. Before I wrap up, I'm going to answer the question that I'm fairly sure someone will ask me at some point before the evening is up. So no, you don't need to. Do you need a design system in your organisation? So that's a pretty simple one to diagnose. First question to ask is, do you have more than 20 designers, developers, and content people working on your digital products? Now, this number actually really varies from organisation to organisation, but in my experience, around 20 to 25 people is the point at which you really start to feel the pain and see the inconsistency. Ideally, probably around 15, you want to be thinking about it more consciously. The second is, are you actually seeing inconsistencies in your customer experience? So have you related to some of the challenges in alignment and inconsistency that I've spoken about today? And the third one is, do you want to design and build faster? Because there is one really important benefit of design systems that I haven't spoken about so far, but it's often the thing that convinces organizations to create one and continue to fund it. So this has been 90% of my job over the last 2 years, trying to make sure that everyone knows about this. So our design system saves designers 50% of their time, and it saves developers 33%, and that number is going up all the time with the maturity of code and the maturity of our deployment in the bank. On average, Constellation saves teams 190K per project, and since we started operating, we've saved the business an estimated 7.5 million over 2 years. I think our projected savings are something around 20 million a year when everyone is using it. So it's a vast amount of money, and it's what keeps us alive as a team. So if this all sounds appealing, you want to reduce some risk like accessibility, you want to do better work, and you want to save some money, and who doesn't want to do that, right? Then you probably need a design system. And that's all from me. Thanks.